All right, after many trials and tribulations, we are finally back. Google Hangouts has been fucking with me. I tried to tell it that I wouldn't have any of it, but honestly, it got the better of me here. So we are running very late. I apologize. I apologize to my very respectful co-hosts who've been sticking this out with me. And we're here to talk about a couple. We're here to talk about Condit versus Alves because there's a ton of young talent on this show, and we'll try and maybe spend some time, go back to last week, talk about some of the good prospect performances there. I would have liked to have spent some time looking at what maybe some of the other smaller shows are doing, like especially the recent World Series of Fighting acquisitions that they picked up some Russian guys lately, and I know one of our watchers asked us to talk about RFA at some point in the near future, and I have been putting that off because I've forgotten all about it. So I remembered just now, right before the show, and I haven't had any time to prepare anything. So we're gonna just charge ahead with our normal shit, and if that turns into some better shit, then that's a benefit to all and sundry. Uh, Tom, thanks for being here.
It's no problem, and I have real modern internet again. This is fantastic.
Yeah, you actually look clean and clear and nice and pretty and almost like a human being. So I'm glad that you're back on real internet. And Pat, thank you once again for joining me.
Hey, that got borderline erotic there with you and Tom there for a second. I'm glad you managed to pull back at the last second.
There's nothing borderline about where we're going.
So homo. Yeah.
Good shit. Let's talk about fighting, huh?
Yes, let's talk about fighting. Let's steer this conversation right back on track. We've got a whole bunch of fun fighters to talk about for tomorrow. Like, there's a whole bunch of people that I'm really looking forward to watching as somebody looking for prospect performance. It could be the kind of card that, like, the fights could all end up being really bad because a lot of times when the UFC books all new young talent, they tend to not book them very well. So we could end up with a lot of bad fights, but there are a lot of guys that I really want to watch fight on tomorrow's card. Anybody that you're most excited for, Pat?
Bektic, Mirsad Bektic.
Yeah.
Very surprising that I would say Bektic. But I had him as the #1 prospect in the world when I did my scouting report a year ago in February. He is 2-0 in the UFC. Took a really dominating performance from Paul Redman the last time out. I had the opportunity to interview him just before that. I mean, at this point, there is no reason to think that he is not an absolutely elite blue chip prospect. I think he's been hit a grand total of 12 times in 30 minutes of cage time thus far. He's really talented. He's a destroyer of worlds from top position. He's a really good wrestler. Is explosive enough to get in on your hips in the middle of the cage, which is a particularly rare skill among MMA wrestlers these days. And he's got a really, really violent top game. I actually tend to think that this is a harder matchup for him than it's getting credit for. I think Lucas Martins is a legitimately talented dude. And if you're thinking about betting on this, I honestly think 5-1 is way, way, way too high a price to pay on Bektic. I think that that's not giving Martins nearly enough credit for his takedown defense, which is actually excellent. The way that Martins has lost fights is by getting ground against the cage, which is not actually Bektic's strong suit if you watch him fight. Martins is really, really good at getting his hips back to the cage, stuffing the attempt. It's just that he's not good at creating space once he's done that. So that's kind of my thoughts on the matchup. I don't know. How do you guys see this playing out here?
I tend to agree with you that I think it's a really interesting piece of matchmaking, and that Martins is. I mean, we talked about how little Bektic got hit in his last fight, and Martins is a dude that puts hands on people and really can hit hard. I mean, the dude knows a little something about violence, but I think Mirsad, man. I mean, it was amazing to me how much Joe Rogan shit on him in his last fight, in a fight in which Mirsad was just dominating the shit out of a really, really experienced, good fighter. I think Martins is going to make this interesting. I think we could see Bektic get tested on the feet a little bit more than in previous fights. But if this hits the mat, I think Bektic is teaching Martins a little something about violence and damage.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean,
I think my big like I'll admit that I'm actually slightly worried here, and the biggest reason I'm worried is that I've yet to see Bektic show himself as a consistent high output striker, somebody who can really string combinations together and land more than one shot at a time. He's a great, he's a good striker. He has good technique. He hits really hard. He does a great job coming in off of his strikes to shoot behind them. So that's at that point I'm not so worried. But if Martins is able to stuff a few takedowns and make Bektic work on from the outside for a while, that's like the one area I'm concerned about, really, and why I do think that Martins has a better chance than he's been given credit for. And I think the biggest problem I've just seen is that Martins it's not so much that he's a good counter wrestler, he's a good offensive striker, but when he gets pressured at all, his offense just shuts down. Like he just stops striking, he stops working. That was the biggest thing we saw in the Elkins fight, was just the pure fact that Elkins was moving forward stopped all of Martins' offense. Like he just didn't throw.
Martins seems as very much one of those strikers that when he's faced, it kind of feels like when he's faced with a guy who presents a multiple threat, like a striking to takedown threat, he will freeze up. And again, and going against Mirsad, that's not a good thing for him. So I do think if Martins kind of opens up, he can be an interesting test. But I feel pretty confident that this one could get ugly fast for Martins. And I feel like he might kind of do a deer in the headlights in this fight.
Yeah. So the other fighter I'm really excited to watch on this card, I mean, I'm excited for several people, and I am excited for Nicholas Dalby, but we'll get to him in a minute. I'm excited to watch Alex Oliveira again.
Yeah, cowboy.
That's a well-booked fight to me. Like, that's a fight where the UFC has done well by Alex Oliveira, and I think that they've given him it's a perfect get-over fight for him, frankly. It's the kind of fighter that he can beat, and casual fans will be like, "Oh, wow, he beat KJ Noons. That's actually a pretty good win."
Yeah, correct. Like, is he replacing somebody?
I
can't remember how.
He's replacing Jan Cabral.
Oh, yeah. This is one of those cases where I think this is actually a better fight than the original by a long stretch. Yeah. Like, Cabral was just going to do his best to grind Noons down, and like the likely outcome of that was Cabral winning kind of a bullshit split decision where Noons hit him a bunch, but Cabral managed to get him down a couple of times and grind him against the fence. This is an action fight. Like there's going to be some violence here. Oliveira is super physically talented. Like that was, I don't think I had really realized that until I saw him in there with Gilbert Burns, who is an excellent athlete, and Oliveira was way faster than Burns is. Like Burns is a really, really good athlete, and Oliveira at times made him look like he was just kind of standing still. What I would worry about in this fight is Oliveira getting tired again, but I don't think that Noons creates the same kinds of challenges in terms of wearing you out that Burns does, in terms of like hanging on you and wearing on you, which like made up for how Burns looked like a deer in the headlights when Oliveira hit him, and Burns is tough. I don't know. Yeah, I like Oliveira in this fight. I think the betting odds have shifted in his direction. How do you all see it?
I really like this fight for a couple of reasons, and you guys have kind of outlined most of them, but I think Oliveira is just, as you guys have pointed out, really, really great athlete. And he and Noons kind of, I feel, are going to play off each other really, really well. And I think Noons is really comfortable in tight, kind of in the pocket, which will be interesting to see how Oliveira responds to that. Because we had a guy, his last outing, we had a guy in Gilbert Burns who obviously was going to strike with him, but his primary goal was to get Oliveira to the mat and kind of pressure forward, get him down, kind of suck him down. And Oliveira, I thought, acquitted himself pretty well in that fight, considering that I think we all think of Burns as like one of the blue chips in the lightweight division, just like one of the top prospects. And the Oliveira made the fight ugly at times. And I think against Noons, we're going to get a nice feeling for in-fight adjustments. Because I feel like Oliveira's the first thing he's looking to do out of the box, I doubt is going to work against Nunes. I feel like he's going to have to kind of assess things and make an in-fight adjustment, and that's kind of what I'm looking forward to in this fight, is seeing how Oliveira deals with some of the problems that Nunes presents as kind of not an outstanding striker in the MMA sphere. Like, I think, it's kind of become a joke, like, that people overplayed Nunes' professional boxing, and, like, that it kind of, like, swung from him being, like, overhyped as a striker, and now I feel he's kind of underplayed as a striker. I think Nunes is going to present problems for him. It's going to be interesting to see if Oliveira can kind of read the ground and adjust what he's doing to kind of capitalize on what Nunes is doing.
Like Nunes, I don't know that Nunes is at this point underrated as a striker. I think he's a kind of a rare type of striker for MMA, given what you highlighted in his comfort in the pocket. But I think that what he does there, more guys should be able to take advantage of that than actually have. Like, Nunes does a lot of changing levels in the pocket, which is not exactly a no-no in MMA, but you need to do it more cleverly than Nunes does. When you are so willing to duck down like that, it really opens you up for knees and high kicks. And I think that that's exactly what we're going to see play out here, because Oliveira's entire striking repertoire is based around taking advantage of those kinds of level changes and running you into a shot, right? So Oliveira, this is a distinction that I've been thinking about for quite a while, and I'm kind of interested to bounce this off you guys because we haven't talked about it. The distinction between an organic striker and a rote striker, where, like, Frankie Edgar is the epitome of a rote striker, where he has an idea of what combination he wants to throw before he even sees what you're going to do. He's thinking, okay, 4 punches and a kick. And he's not really trying to adjust it based on where your head is or which way you're moving or anything like that. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I'm not trying. You can go way overboard with trying to respond to what your opponent's doing. Like, Uriah Faber, on the other hand, is like a very organic striker, but that leads to him overthinking shit and not throwing and only throwing one shot at a time. But I think Oliveira is a really organic striker. Where he sees what you're doing and he plays off that right away. So if he sees you ducking down in the pocket the way that Gilbert Burns was, he's going to start throwing uppercuts or knees or what have you, which makes this a really interesting kind of tactical matchup to me that I think favors Oliveira by a pretty strong stretch, because he's going to see what Nunes is doing in the pocket. He's longer. He's got the tools to take advantage of that. Like, I mean, obviously Nunes has drastic edges and experience, but I think that kind of tactical matchup here favors Oliveira.
Yeah, I think a big thing that, well, the big thing for me when I watch Oliveira fight is really that, like, he has the perfect type of boxing or even striking, I would say, for MMA. Like, his game is perfectly built for MMA striking and for success in MMA striking. I mean, it's the same kind of striking, and I kind of put him in, like, a similar stylistic category as, like, Anthony Johnson or Joanna Jędrzejczyk, or, like, just sort of what's going on?
Pat just looked really happy the moment you brought up Jędrzejczyk.
No, sorry. This is I'm looking at the tweeter, and apparently, like, yeah, never pay me no mind. I'm working on other stuff.
Okay, yeah, okay. So Pat's off in his own world there. That's what I thought was going on. And then Tom was smiling too, and I thought, okay, wait, I must have, like, is there something on my face? Who knows? Anyway, like, there's this, there is a style of striking out there, and like, I'm using those two as, like, great examples. But another guy that I see a lot of this kind of style of striking from would be, like, Kevin Souza, or guy, and it's this hands low at your hips, your feet wide, and really moving your head. I don't know. Sorry, this is insanely distracting. But feet wide, and just, like, really looking for what your opponent does so that you can counter it with combinations while still being aggressive. And Oliveira just does that really excellently. He does some weird stuff that I love, like his single collar tie to uppercuts weird thing that he has is, like, it's fantastic when he does it. It's awesome. But it's also one of those things where it's like, holy shit, like, there's nobody does that, and maybe there's a reason, and you're going to get caught hard for it someday. It may not be this fight, but I hope he pulls it out. Like I hope he does that because he just will like grab a single collar tie and start throwing hooks and uppercuts from like in the pocket without a whole lot of control, and it's kind of fantastic.
He's got a really fantastic frame for MMA. Like where he's really long. He's not necessarily super tall, but he's really long, right? Like he's got freakishly long arms and legs, and that's really really useful. I think it's more useful in MMA than it is in any other combat sport because of the way that you need long limbs for leverage in the clinch and leverage for takedown defense. Like you need to be able to dig an underhook and jack it and jack an underhook to get out of the clinch, or for a wide variety of purposes you need long limbs. And Oliveira has those, and Oliveira has that in spades. But like, I mean, in terms of how the MMA striking game differs from boxing or kickboxing, it's not that it's any more or less complex. It's just different. Right? Like there's a lot more changing levels in the pocket in MMA than there is in kickboxing, and that requires you to have different tools available to you. And having to stuff takedowns at that range too means that it's really hard to play with the kind of high tight guard that you would normally see in boxing or kickboxing. Like so that requires you to do different things with head movement. And a guy like Oliveira uses that really well. He plays a kind of a hands low game, which allows him to defend the takedowns, but at the same time, he has multiple layers of defense because he uses distance and angles, but then he also moves his head off the center line as well. So I don't know. It's really kind of a prototypical thing that we don't talk about very much.
Yeah, it's something that I'm interested to see. I'm interested to see how well he does with it because it is like I look at that kind of striking and I think that's what we should be hoping to see every fighter do. You know, that's what we want to see more fighters create in the cage, is that kind of that style of striking where we can finally stop hearing announcers talk about, oh, he's got his hands low and all that kind of stuff. And it's just one of those things that I hope guys like Oliveira, I wish Rumble had been able to do more of it against DC. Women like Jędrzejczyk, guys like Kevin Souza, formerly Eddie Wineland was a guy who did it a lot. Like I want to see more people come out and use this style and make it popular because I think it's just like it's the right way to strike in MMA.
Yeah, if you want to play a high tight guard in MMA, you need to have a really, really strong sense of where your opponent's at. Like you need to have really good hand-eye coordination and spatial awareness to be able to understand very precisely the distances that they want to work at. Like, so this, I think, was Rumble's problem against Cormier, is that he did not do a good job of understanding where he was relative to Cormier and how quickly Cormier could get in on him. So if you want to play a high tight guard, I think you need to do a lot of keeping your right hand up and posting with your left hand, like stretching out your left hand and using that to create head pressure if you need to, if they're going to try and shoot from the edge of your range, or alternatively just to measure, just to see where they're at. Like, I don't know, does that make sense?
So what you're saying, Pat, what you're saying is that Royce Gracie was so far ahead of his day.
So far, yes. Very far ahead of his game.
So far ahead, you still can't even see him. But no, I think what the one hand up, the other hand out, that is like the basic that we see out of most fighters as like their way to strike in MMA is, I would say that's what we see as like the common technique because it's easier. Like it's a much easier thing to learn. It's like keep the one hand up, put the other hand out. We see guys moving away, and it's why we see eye pokes. You see guys moving away with their hand out all the time, and they stop and their opponent runs straight into their hand. It's basically what John Jones does. Like that is how he defends at range.
Yeah, and I think that there's an argument to be made that that's just the right way to do it in MMA. Like the hand lower hands thing I think also works as long as you're going to combine that with head movement. But like I actually think the crab style, like sometimes some people call it the Philly shell, where you have your right hand high, your chin tucked behind your left shoulder, and then your left arm folded across, folded across your stomach. Ally uses that a lot. James Toney made that famous, of course, Floyd Mayweather. I actually think that that has a lot more utility in MMA even than maybe it does in boxing because of having that hand low, ready to get an underhook. Robert Whitaker uses it too.
Mark Hunt.
Yeah, Mark Hunt uses it. Mm-hmm.
Yep. And it's funny too because I distinctly to this day remember some terrible ESPN interview where they like brought on Chuck Liddell to like argue with Floyd Mayweather, and like Chuck distinctly like specifically pointed out, this was like 2008 2009, like distinctly pointed to like the crab and shoulder rolls and saying that'll never work in MMA.
Yeah, Chuck Liddell, defensive genius, weighing in on what does and doesn't work in MMA striking. Like,
why didn't people take this seriously back then again? It's crazy.
Christ, like that was peak 2008 MMA right there, wrapped up in one interview. Like
you can't shoulder roll in MMA, bro. You'll get kicked in the head.
Yeah, I mean, like, oh God, don't even. I can't even. We're gonna get off on a tangent that's gonna end up with me shitting on a former longtime light heavyweight champion.
Okay. So what we're saying is we're really excited for Alex Oliveira because he shows one of the archetypal styles that we like to see in MMA striking. It's a style that I think we're seeing more of over time. It used to be just a few guys like Eddie Wineland were doing it, and it was always just talked about, he keeps his hands low, but he's such a good boxer. And now we're starting to see actually more fighters fight like that. I can think of not a lot, but at least a few guys that are coming out working that style and who make it work well. Like I say, Kevin Souza's kind of like he's like the bottom end of that kind of style, and he's still a pretty good striker in MMA. Like he's effective. Other people we're excited for, obviously, we got to talk about Nicholas Dalby. How could we not talk about it? Nicholas Dalby. We're excited. I honestly do think he can walk in and be a top 20 welterweight in the UFC, like day one.
Yeah, he's like an unholy cross between Martin Kampman and Tarek Safadine, or not unholy. I mean, he's like Dalby is not the kind of prospect that gets your pulse up. Like you don't watch him fight and think like, holy shit, this dude's going to be a superstar. He's just really good at pretty much everything that he does. He works at a good pace. He's got pretty solid defensive skills, especially considering he's only been fighting for 4 years. He doesn't hit hard, but he's not pillow-fisted. Like, he can shoot takedowns when he wants to. He can control from top position. He can grind against the cage. There are no holes in his skill sets. He may not blow you away at anything, but his striking is a plus enough skill set that he can rely on that while using the other things to kind of get by. Like, he's just good. And he's young enough that he's still got probably a few years to get better as well.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to Dalby getting into the UFC. I was kind of waiting when we brought this up for Pat to like play it off like clearly Zane and I don't think he's gonna land a single punch in this fight. No, I think Dalby. Obviously, we looked at him pretty closely for our 170 list. I like his striking a lot. He's a very polished striker. I think he's going to do a very nice job in the UFC. I think Capoeira is pretty well picked for him to look good against in the terms of like at range. I think he's going to pick Capoeira apart. He's flashed more offensive wrestling or willingness to wrestle offensively in the last one, but it wasn't top level wrestling. I think he's gonna have a really rough time when he gets in there with some of the better wrestlers. The wrestlers in the top 20 welterweight. I think he's gonna have a hard time wrestling with those guys, but I think he'll do just fine. He'll fill a very nice position in the welterweight division. I think he'll have a good UFC career, and I think this is going to be the beginning of it. And he's getting a pretty nice matchup in kind of a Brazilian brawler grinder type. Like Capoeira, he's more than happy to stand at range and throw spinning stuff. He will more than happily move into punching range and just start unloading and brawling a little bit. And he mixes in takedowns with a really grindy, just absolutely push you through the fence and leave a nice little chain-linked marks all over your body grappling style.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's it's a good fight that Dolby should look good in. I think Zaleski's going to end up getting just kind of frozen out there, waiting for the opportunity to counter and getting hit 5 times while he's looking for it. That's very likely what we're going to see. It should be, like I say, I think Dolby's somebody that can walk in and be a top 20 kind of guy within short order. He may not be, I don't know, did he ever be a title contender, but I think he's easy, a strong fighter right out of the gate for them in a way that, and obviously he's much more polished and skilled, but it's sort of like the whole Eric Silva, Hung Yu Lim thing, where like those guys were able to do it just with athleticism alone, where they could just walk in and be like immediately a top 20, never gonna contend for a title, but top 20 from the day they walked in the UFC.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, so there are two other prospects that we got to talk about, but first I want to know, have either of you guys taken a close look at Erica Almeida, and what do you think of her?
I've taken a look at a couple of her fights, and it's going to be interesting because the thing about strawweight right now is that, or women's strawweight, I should say, is that I feel like we're having a developing metagame at like the top right now, and like Jędrzejczyk kind of completely reset it. The way she just absolutely demolished Carla Esparza, like that right now is kind of the game you have to beat. And I don't think Almeida is built that way at all. She reminds me a lot of oh god, I'm blanking on it, but her game mostly consists of she's very, very willing to play guard, to the point where she'll actively pull guard in fights. She's undersized for the division. She could very easily be an atomweight. And so she ends up bottom grappling a lot, and she excels at it. Jessica Penne, that's who I'm thinking of. She reminds me of Jessica Penne in a lot of ways. And I think the same problems are going to kind of follow her for being undersized. She'll be able to be out, like at the upper level, she'll be at a strength disadvantage. And then just the inherent problems of playing guard in MMA, though they're lesser right now in women's MMA. And I feel specifically when we get into the really lightweight classes, I feel like guard becomes slightly more viable because the game kind of changes there, and like the ability to like invert and things like that for women is pretty strong. I haven't seen enough of her guard to know if she's like kind of a wizard technician at it, or if she's just really flexible, because like Ryan Hall has really great saying that like flexibility is the small person's strength. Like you can compensate for a lot of technical deficiencies when you're small by being crazy flexible. And the thing about being flexible is people will look at it and be like, "Oh my God, look at that technique," when actually it's mediocre technique, but you're getting away with it because you can put your foot behind your back, and like they can't pass your guard because you're a ball, and how do you pass the guard of a ball? So I'm going to be really interested to see how Almeida does in this. But I think to succeed at like higher levels, she's going to have to adjust her game quite a bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think Tom got into a lot more depth than I was planning on. The problem that I see is that Almeida has next to no ability to wrestle at all. Like, I think the Penne comparison is a really, really strong one, but at least Penne has always had a really nice clinch takedown game, nice trips, a nice head and arm throw, and what have you. Almeida doesn't have that. Like, at this point, she's a willing striker. She's drastically improved, and she uses that very well to cover her clinch entries. But I cannot imagine a competent women's strawweight succumbing to the kinds of takedowns that Almeida has at her disposal at this point. So like, I think she's very talented, and if she were to become a better takedown artist or a better striker, I think that she could easily be competitive with the upper echelon of the division. But as it stands right now, what we're going to see in this fight a lot, I think, is her punching her way into the clinch, Lima grabbing double underhooks, pushing her towards the cage, and then just wearing on her for 40 seconds until the referee separates them, and kind of rinse and repeat over and over again until Almeida is tired or the final bell sounds, like one of the two. Like, I just don't think Almeida has enough depth of skill as a striker to compete for long periods at range. She doesn't have the wrestling to get people down. She's a good grappler, and she's a pretty decent transitional fighter, but I just don't see the rest of those pieces being there quite yet.
I think the big key on like what kind of fight we're gonna see is if Juliana is willing to disengage, because Almeida will pull guard to the point where like she'll actively jump guard and like to a certain extent slam herself on it. I don't know if she's gonna have that big of an edge, and I don't know if Almeida's gonna be able to like really work her guard game on Goiania even then, because I mean like she comes out of some pretty darn good like jiu-jitsu lineage when you're talking about Goiania. So I don't. It'll be interesting to see how this plays. I think she would be well enough coached to just understand that if it hits the mat, disengage, get the fight back up to the feet, and then kind of get it back into the clinch where she really has nothing to do but pull guard.
Yeah, I don't know. Lima's a fighter that I'm both more and less impressed with than I think a lot of other people are. So I'm kind of split on that. Like, I think she's a much better wrestler than people give her credit for. I actually think she's one of the better wrestlers in the division in terms of actual, like, the technique with which she gets takedowns. You almost never see her go for, like, a head and arm throw. She's almost always getting in on a double, switching to a single, and getting the takedown. But then at the same time, a lot of people are like, well, you know, she's got her Muay Thai game, and she's really going to do well in the stand-up, and I've never seen Lima look be anything beyond mediocre as a striker.
She's a 115-pound Czech Congo. Like,
Yeah.
I don't mean that. I don't mean that as an insult. Like that,
No.
but that's very much her game. She's billed as a striker, but really she's kind of a grinding clinch grappler and wrestler. She
Yeah.
likes to work in top position, and then when you get her at range, she'll throw a 1-2 and some low kicks, but like she's not. That's not her game. That's not what she's looking to do. She's a good athlete, and she's very very strong.
Yeah.
And she's a big 115-pounder, and like that's kind of it. That's what she does, and that's cool. It's just not what she's built as.
I think people get stopped at the nickname, like, oh, Ju Tai, and she does Muay Thai, so she's a Muay Thai striker. It's like, have you really watched this woman? Because she will strike for no more than like 30 seconds at a time.
Yeah. I think in large part it's because she doesn't have the way that she strikes. If she were going to try and do that for extended periods of time in MMA, it would burn out her gas tank pretty fast.
Yeah.
And so she's kind of forced to shorten the fight with that kind of clinch grinding and takedown attempts in order to preserve her gas.
Yeah. So I don't know. I'll be interested to see if she can ride out Almeida for 15 minutes, because Lima's not a finisher either. It's not like she's a great submission grappler or somebody who's going to get knockouts. She's just going to be grinding away, trying to take rounds. So.
Well, against the guard player, that's a pretty ideal. In MMA, that works very well against the guard player most times. I think that.
Yeah, but I don't know that I see it. I don't know. I'm not as sold on Erica Almeida as a guard taker. She seems more like the footage I saw of her seemed like she was a lot more of like a back take kind of grappler, somebody who's really looking to get to the back as quickly as they can. And if she ends up on her back, then that's one thing. But I don't know. We'll see how that plays out. Anyway, other fight. Tom Breeze, he should have I don't know. This should be a tough test, but I expect him to look pretty good against Luis Dutra.
Yeah, I'm excited for Tom Breeze. Him going to TriStar, I think, is a really solid move for him because he's a good athlete, and when watching him, I mean, I remember scouting him for our welterweight report and kind of thinking he kind of looked already kind of like Joe Lozani, where like he was aggressive to a fault, like always hunting for the submission, and I think TriStar is the perfect place for him to tighten up what he's doing, continue growing the athleticism, but also kind of rein in the over-aggression at times. So I think it's a really good camp fit for him, and as soon as I heard him going to TriStar, I immediately started thinking that he's going to go a bit farther than I maybe initially thought when I looked at him, and I forget where he was fighting out of it was somewhere out of Birmingham, wasn't it? Or somewhere. I mean, obviously it was somewhere in England, but I think the camp change has been really good for him, and I think this is a good, interesting fight to kind of get a good introduction to Breeze in the UFC.
Yeah, I think he should take this pretty handily, and I don't know. Like I was always pretty high on Breeze. The only thing that kept me off him was the fact that he was injured and out for as long as he was. Like he started fighting pretty young. He looks like a good athlete. He's very strong. I'm really struck by he really gets a lot of force behind his shots. Like he doesn't have that kind of like gangly tall guy awkwardness. Like he really snaps his punches and his kicks. Like there's a lot of force behind them. I think he looks to me like he's got good cardio. He's a good wrestler. He's a very good top position player. Very, very, very strong from the top. His base is almost unshakable. I mean, I really think he could be kind of a top 10 like a top 10 fighter in this division sooner rather than later. The fact that he's a tri-star also helps because, for us, a hobby is going to break him down into like kind of a formless lump of clay, can then reshape itself based on the challenge in front of it.
Components.
I'm sorry?
I said into his base components.
Yeah, basically. You can just then like take him off the shelf in various pieces and reassemble him based on who he's fighting. I don't know. I really think Brees is going to be pretty good. I think he's at the perfect camp for that. It's hard to tell we were talking about this before the show, Tom, but it's hard to tell what to make of Dutra because he's fought so little, and we have no idea what he's going to look like on a fight-to-fight basis because there's 2 minutes of tape on him in the last 4 years.
Yeah, I mean we're talking about a guy who has under 15 fights, but has been fighting since 2003, and there's almost no tape on him in recent years. It's really I don't know. It's like the epitome of Brazilian MMA problems. It's just huge gaps, been fighting forever. I mean, it's really hard to see consistent performance from there and to predict where a guy like that is going. So it's going to be an interesting fight for both of them because. I mean, obviously, Durata's not a prospect. He's not really a guy that we would be talking about if he wasn't fighting someone who we consider to be a prospect. But just in general, watching a guy evolve his game, I mean, I'm not sure what his game is. And we're talking about a guy who, oh God, who did he lose to in his first UFC fight?
Kunimoto, and that was because Dutra just elbowed the shit out of the back of his head. Dutra was pushing him up against the cage, Kunimoto, his Kunimoto thing, where he pushed him up against the cage, and Dutra just elbowed the crap out of the back of his head. They were 12-6, and B, they were directly to his brainstem. That's not allowed, bro. You can't do that. That's not okay.
Yeah, dude, you're not in some Valley Tudo show in a basement somewhere. You got to read the rules before you get in there.
I think, and that's actually the takeaway I've had of Dutra over what tape I've watched of him and what I've seen of him in The Ultimate Fighter and stuff like that, is that he's a guy who tries to be more athletic than he is. He fights like he's a better athlete than he is. And what that means is that he puts himself in positions to get injured. I would assume if he fights like that when he's training, that's why he's getting injured. If he's training like that, and then in the cage, he just he's the kind of guy who will throw himself bodily at you, come what may.
Yeah.
And he reminds me of who was the guy at bantamweight who got DQ'd and almost DQ'd again against Hani Yahya?
Johnny Bedford.
Johnny Bedford. He reminds me of Johnny Bedford. Johnny Bedford's the kind of guy who fought like a much better athlete than he was. He would just go out there and just I'm just gonna chuck myself at you, see what happens.
Yep.
I think that theory is pretty strongly supported. That Dorada's his 3 losses in MMA. One of them's a DQ, and then 2 of them are him sustaining injuries during the fight and having to call it. He blew out his knee in one fight against Paul Tiago of all people. And then way back there, he appears to have pulled out of a fight due to a shoulder injury mid-fight. So I think that's a good read on him, Zane.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I really can't see Brees having much in the way of problems with him. I don't. It doesn't seem super competitive to me. I could be totally wrong, but I just think Brees handles him.
Well, I could see it being the Yahya Bedford fight for a little bit, where in the second time around, where Bedford came out really strong, and then Yahya was just oh wait, I can just take you down and lay on you. I don't have to put up with this. and that was kind of how that fight went. So I could see that being the case. The only thing that's slightly a question mark I heard on from Marcelo Alonso on the round table when I was doing that with him on Sherdog was it Dutra like just now got enough money from sponsorship and fighting to be able to train full time for the first time in his career?
Mhm.
And so he's like actually in the gym now. So that could make a difference, but we'll see. I mean, when somebody's been around that long, I'm always wary of like late career improvement.
Yeah, I mean, I honestly, like, I'm not trying to pile on you guys or anything like this, but like I really feel like Breeze is almost an elite prospect. Like that he has pretty much everything that we're looking for. Like he's undefeated. I don't think in none of those fights has he been really, really seriously challenged. At least not without him immediately adjusting and coming back. He's despite the fact that he's British, he's an excellent he's a good wrestler, and he's training at a camp that's going to make him an excellent wrestler.
Yeah.
He's strong from the top. Like I don't really see anything to knock. I mean, he's fought and beaten good competition. Like I don't see this is the kind of fight that an elite prospect should dominate.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think just at the time we made the list, he hadn't fought in 2 years. So
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and that was the thing. Like I distinctly I think I said when he went with TriStar, I kind of took a second. I'm like, I went and watched some of his fights again. I'm like, if he does things right at TriStar, he's gonna get really good. Like that is a perfect fit for him. And I think it's the perfect place that's gonna enhance what he already does well and help him build up what he doesn't do well.
So, on that note, let's talk briefly about UFC 187. There weren't a lot of prospects on this card. It wasn't really it wasn't a card for prospects. It was a card mostly for the UFC to show off their developed talent. But Islam Makhachev, he showed up, and that's a good thing.
Yeah. It was I had a really hard time finding tape on this dude in the lead up to it, so it was really nice to get him. It was nice to see him like a full fight with him. And my takeaway was while he has a really similar game to his like BFF Khabib, he does have some subtleties, like some differences, and he's more than willing to jump on your back, put in the hooks, and he's much more like a submission grappler. Like he's much more like that was always my kind of thing on Khabib was that I mean the guy and obviously I've come to appreciate his game, but like in the early going when he was first coming into the UFC, I kind of looked at this guy, really good wrestler, but kind of needs a ground game to go with it, needs something else. Like oh no, he can just take dudes down for like 20 minutes and he's perfectly happy to just pick you up again and put you back down. Islam is kind of like more of what I was thinking when I was seeing Khabib early on of like where I thought his game was going. And I think it'll play really well in the UFC. I think there'll be a couple fights where he'll take dudes down and then spend the whole fight on their back and not find anything. I think, but a well developed game already, a good athlete, and dude even looks like Khabib when he gets in there. Like he gets the same haircut going, and like yeah. I just want to see them. I want to see them standing there with like whatever piece of jewelry it is that they share as as BFFs.
I really want to see. I really want to see Khabib playing the Paul Heyman role for Makhachev, like just endlessly talking shit on his behalf and cutting promos for him. Also, I would say the big difference between the two of them, Makhachev's unibrow game is just real strong. It's a real unibrow game.
It's not to be messed with.
No, it's like I'm interested in that. I think that Makhachev and Khabib, if you look back to when Khabib entered the UFC, he was a little less experienced. Khabib had more fights but had fewer years in the game than Makhachev when he debuted. I think Khabib was a better physical talent. I think Khabib is still a tremendous athlete, and I think he's just a notch above. He's an elite athlete, and I think that he's just a step above Makhachev. But I think that Makhachev is substantially more skilled, aside from pure takedown prowess, than Khabib was. Like I think he's a much better striker. That check hook that he was throwing, he's a much better kicker than Khabib still is. Actually, now that I'm thinking about it. He's got much more of a submission. He's got much more of a submission game. They're different fighters, even though they share some technical similarities. in terms of the clinch. But like, man, having watched a whole bunch of Abdulmanap Nurmagomedov's fighters at this point, if you're going to beat them, you just can't ever let them touch you, right? Like, that seems to be the game plan.
Yep.
Pretty much. Yeah. I mean, they have so many ways to throw people off balance. It's like the Ronda Rousey thing. It's basically like there's an understanding there of exactly how you throw somebody to the ground. And the variety of ways in which you do it are enough that you can't, as a fighter, prepare for that. Like, you can't go in saying, "Oh no, I did some judo training for this fight. I know what to look for." It's just like, really? Because it's all about constantly changing planes and angles on your way to the ground, and unless you're like really, really familiar with that, you're not going to keep up with it.
6 months of sprawl training just ain't cutting it anymore.
No.
Yeah, seriously. I mean, when you're talking about dudes who have been throwing each other to the ground with more or less violence since they were small children, like, yeah, no, like, you can't bring in your local judo brown belt to work that stuff with you and expect to be prepared for it. Like, so you reach the point when you're trying to game plan for guys like that, where the only real way to do it is to try and minimize the amount of time you spend in contact with them. Where, like, basically the whole fight you have to be thinking, okay, I've got to keep you at arm's length, work on like my back step punching and staying away from the fence, and like, which is not most guys' games to start with. So you're forcing guys to fight out of type from the very beginning of the fight. I mean, it's a substantial challenge.
I mean, that's what you see with people when they fight Matt Brown. I mean, it's the same kind of challenge. It's like, I cannot let this guy clinch up with me, because if he gets me in the clinch, I can't fight. Like, you can't train to fight. That's one of the things I think about clinch fighting. I can't remember when I made this argument, but it's a process. Everybody has like basic decent clinch fighting now, but to get really, really good at it, you have to put in so much work, and it's so difficult that the people who do it really well can't really be matched there.
Yeah, it's why the specialized background is not going to fade into the past of MMA, and we're not going to be inundated with dudes who have been training MMA since they were 7. Like, that's not going to happen, because when it comes down to it, you get dudes or guys or girls who come in with a specific skill set that they've been doing since age 7 to like 18, 19, 20, and then they flip to MMA and they start picking up the other skills, and then they build a skill set, but there's one thing they can go to that if you haven't been doing since they were that age, you're going to have no ability to contest it unless you're an utter freak athlete. And I feel like that's kind of what we saw also with like Covington and Pyle. Like, Pyle, long time MMA veteran. Colby Covington, new kid on the block. Pyle had some things for him. I mean, Pyle had some like rolling through on Kimuras and like had some tricks for him, like had the veteran savvy. And then in the end, Colby Covington is just like, dude, I've been this high-level wrestler since I was 5. I'm picking you up and putting you down.
Yeah, I mean, Covington, like, he was definitely the other fighter. I mean, and Scoggins as well, but they both put on, like, they had what I would like to think of as, like, get rounds performances, where they went out there and took on a fighter that, even if that fighter had some areas where they were dangerous, wasn't actually that dangerous, but was tough enough to just like keep them in the fight, get rounds, pick up, go out and win rounds and get experience. And they were just experience building performances for both guys. Mm-hmm. The kind of fights you want to see your prospects have.
Yeah, beating Mike Pyle, not an insignificant thing for a guy Colby Covington, like as young as Colby Covington. That's a big deal. Yeah. I know it wasn't like super like aesthetically pleasing for fans, but like getting a fight like that, getting 3 rounds with a guy of that level of saltiness is pretty impressive.
Pyle is so salty.
Yeah, Covington has been a professional mixed martial artist for a little over 3 years, right? Like, to beat a guy like Mike Pyle, who's been in the game for 16 years, with an almost infinite amount of experience. Like, there's literally nothing Mike Pyle doesn't know how to do. If you can impose your game on Mike Pyle, you're a talent to watch. I mean, there's still things that Covington needs to work on, obviously, but you know, if you're looking for him to take the next step, like beating the crap out of Mike Pyle is not a bad way to start.
Yeah, it was a good performance, and like I say, it's the kind of performance where if you're watching, when you watch a lot of Prospect MMA, that like if getting to the UFC, that's the kind of performance you want your prospect to have, because it's one thing like doing what Makachev did, like that's a great way to show off. Like Makachev looked great, he really showed off, but like is Makachev going to come away with that from that with like, oh yeah, that was really a building fight for me? Probably not. Like
Yeah.
he didn't get tested that much. He was able to stay on it, land his strikes when he threw them, throw the guy to the ground when he needed to, and then get the sub. And whereas guys like Covington, Covington had to work, and he was able to work and to beat somebody who had a whole lot more time on him.
Mm-hmm.
So to me, I mean, it's not an aesthetically pleasing win, but it's the kind of win. It's like that Chris Weidman versus Alfaya, was it, when he was like right before he got to the UFC, or Damian Maia? Like Damian, it went over Damian Maia. That's not a pretty win, but it was like that's a great win for coming up.
If you're looking at those like future champion type of prospects, you've got to look for the ability to grind one out when they have to. Like that's one of the, I would say, far more than the finish, which was awesome. But what really impressed me about Aljamain Sterling's win over Takeo Mitsugaki was that he was just willing to grind out long stretches of that fight when he had to. Like you don't want to hang out in the pocket with Mitsugaki, so dive into the clinch, push him up against the fence, and work him over for a while. Take some of the starch out of his sails, and then look for the finish eventually. That's a skill set. Every single champion has that skill set, whether they use it all the time or not. Every single guy can do that. Jose Aldo can grind you up against the fence when he needs to. TJ Dillashaw can grind you when he has to. Demetrius Johnson is a king. It is probably the best in MMA at that, if we're being honest about it.
Yeah, Rafael dos Anjos, like that's, he put a serious grind on Anthony Pettis.
Yeah, that's not an optional skill set if you want to be a truly elite fighter. So it's nice to see a guy who's willing to employ that when necessary.
Yeah. So on that note, I know Tom's got to cut out of here, and we've all got other shit to do. So we're going to make this a little bit of a short show, especially with the late start and me fucking things up at the beginning. Google Hangouts especially, but I'll take some responsibility for that. So on that note, you can find me on Twitter at TheZaneSimon, find Tom on Twitter at TP_Grant, Pat on Twitter at Patrick_Wyman, find Patrick over on SureDog, Tom and I over on Bloody Elbow. Give the show a like if you liked it. If you didn't like it, give it a like, because fuck you. You watched far. If you watched to the end of the show and you didn't like it, then I can't help you. You should tell us that you liked it anyway. And subscribe to MMANation.com for more shit like this, and we'll see y'all next time.